That's a very important point. That you don't take what we've covered since Friday and think that that means we've done steps 1 and 2. We've just given you tools. Some of you, that doesn't mean some of you haven't experienced your own first step. That doesn't mean some of you... I'll give you an example. About a month ago, I did a thing in Cleveland with 30 people. It was a little different than this because the whole weekend it was just 30 of us in a circle. Yeah. And it was more of an experiential retreat than a seminar. And half the people from that weekend, we spent the whole weekend on steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. Half the people in the room were moved into inventory by the experience. And inventory just started coming out of them. The other half of the people said, no, let's start a big book workshop and let's thoroughly review with the tapes and the book and the workbook and all the tools that we can share with you. Let's thoroughly review 1, 2, and 3 and then move into inventory. So they had different experiences. But don't think just because we've talked about 1 and 2 that we're done with 1 and 2. We've done about as much with 1 and 2 as we can this weekend. Let's talk about step 3. We're going to look from the bottom. We're going to look from the bottom of page 58. Actually, we're going to cover a couple things on 58 and 59, and we're actually going to start from where it says, being convinced we're at step 3, from the bottom of page 60 through the prayer on page 63. And we're going to give you some tools to use with how it works. We're going to give you some stuff to consider with the ABCs. Then we're going to look at 2 parts to the 3rd step. We're going to look at the 3rd step requirement, and then we're going to look at the 3rd step decision. So, remember one of our questions last night, is there a requirement in the big book before taking the 3rd step? You're going to see that there is a 3rd step requirement before you even get to the prayer. I'll tell you my misconceptions and then we'll start on page 58. My first misconception was that deciding to turn my will and my life over to the care of God, taking the 3rd step, was turning my will and my life over to the care of God. And my sponsor says, no, it's just a decision. You know, they start with those jokes around that time. 3 frogs sitting on a log, how many are left? And you say none, and they say 3 because all you did was decide. Now what are you going to do? And they started all that stuff because the 3rd step is but a decision. Then I thought, okay, the 3rd step is just a decision. Then doing the prayer is making the decision. They said, no. The decision at the 3rd step comes before the prayer. And we'll show you where that is. Then there's a set of promises. Then there's the prayer. But before the decision, there's a requirement. And we'll get to the requirement. But before the requirement, there's 3 things you need to be convinced of. But before those 3 things you need to be convinced of, there's a couple other points we want to check on. So those are the points we're going to stop at. And I'd like you to repeat all that back to me.
Thank you, dear.
We're going to pause at the 3 pertinent ideas, A, B, C. That'll be point number 1. Point number 2, we're going to look at the first requirement of the 3rd step. Point number 3, we're going to look at the 3rd step decision. And point number 4, we're going to look at the 3rd step prayer. I probably should have said point number 4, we're going to look at the 3rd step promises that come before the prayer. And point number 5, we're going to look at the 3rd step prayer. So we're going to stop at 5 basic points. But before that, we might as well start on 58 with how it works.
Chapter 5, how it works. I never understood that. I sit in meetings and I hear this consistently. I don't know how it works, I just know it works. We have a whole chapter that tells us how it works. I don't know why those people say that. Rarely.
How many times has how it works been read? So many times that we no longer believe that how it works is how it works. And the other question would be, how many times do you have to hear how it works read before you realize that how it works actually means how it works?
Right. And what is it? Rarely have we seen a person fail as thoroughly followed her path. Now, another way that I think I read that is, rarely have I seen Mark thoroughly follow this path. Those who do not recover. are people who cannot or will not, highlight those two words, either cannot or will not, completely give themselves to this simple program, usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. There are such unfortunates. They are not at fault. They seem to have been born that way. They are naturally incapable of grasping and developing a manner of living which demands rigorous honesty. Their chances are less than average. This is one paragraph, by the way, I want to mention, that if you don't put your name in, if you're like me, you're absolutely convinced they're talking about everyone in AA except you. I mean, don't you feel sorry for these 4 people? Now look at the next group. There are those too who suffer from grave emotional mental disorders, but many of them do recover. There's the word if again. They have the capacity to be honest. I mean, there's a huge part of me that doesn't want to realize that I'm in every sentence of that paragraph that I just read. That I'm constitutionally incapable of being honest. And, you know, I don't like this either. Mark is naturally incapable of grasping and developing the manner of living which demands rigorous honesty. Mark's chances are less than average. Mark suffers from grave emotional mental disorders. But Mark will recover if Mark has the capacity to be honest. So our stories will disclose in a general way what we used to be like, what happened to us, and what we're like now. Now, we told you about this earlier, before someone begins working the steps. If you have decided you want what we have, and are willing to go to any length to get it, there's that word it again, what does it mean? Then you are ready to take certain steps.
This can be a good time, now that we've done the first 2 steps, when you get to page 58, to reaffirm your decision by glancing at the 12 steps as outlined on the next page and agreeing to do the rest of this work, which is go to any length. And agreeing that you want what these people have to offer. What these people have to offer is a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. That's what it is. So on page, also I'd like to bring up a point where there's pages where it never makes sense until you do the work up to the paragraph you've just read. I'll show you one. How many times did I hear how it works and I thought the first paragraph was about those poor people that weren't going to make it? Rarely have we seen a person fail who is thoroughly found. Those who do not recover are people who can't, constitutionally incapable, can't grasp and develop a manner of living that demands rigorous honesty. And I used to think, gosh, those poor people that aren't going to get this program. I did the work up to page 58, and here's the question I'd like you to ask yourself with paragraph 1. Does this paragraph describe me? Because I did the work up to page 58, and I read that paragraph that Mark just went through, and that paragraph described me. Because on my own, without God, I am constitutionally incapable of telling the true from the false. We looked at that way back at the doctor's opinion. I can't see truth on my own. I can't tell the truth on my own. I am constitutionally incapable, and I have grave emotional and mental disorders, like the mental disorder that's going to take me back to the first drink. And all of a sudden, a paragraph that didn't describe me for months and months and months, whenever you read it in a meeting, I did the work up to page 58, and that paragraph describes me. Then with the second paragraph, I reaffirmed, is this work what I really want to do, and am I willing to go to any length to do it? That takes us through the 12 steps on page 59, and I agree to submit myself to the rest of this work. Now I'll show you another paragraph that never made any sense. What in the world do they mean by this? Our description of the alcoholic, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear 3 pertinent ideas, just before the ABCs. What do they mean, before and after? Then I did the work up to page 60, and all of a sudden I heard that paragraph, and I went, my God, the description of the alcoholic, that's step 1. The chapter to the agnostic, that's step 2. And all that work, they've been referring to my personal adventures before the first drink and after the first drink. And this work that I've done so far has made clear 3 pertinent ideas. So here's how I read it now. My first step in the description of the alcoholic, and my second step in the chapter to the agnostic, and my own personal adventures before the first drink and after the first drink, has made clear that drunk or sober, I'm alcoholic and can't manage my own life. And that drunk or sober, no human power can relieve what I suffer from. And you know what? I'm willing to believe that not only God can, but that He will if I seek Him. And all of a sudden, that paragraph that didn't make any sense, all of a sudden makes a whole lot of sense. With C, I think it's important, and we're going to do another meditation here pretty soon before we do the third step. With C, I didn't have any problem. I don't think probably anybody in this room, if you've done steps 1 and 2, has a problem with Kenny, that God could. But I've always had some apprehension about Woody, for me, just as I am. Because I had this old idea that needed to be gotten rid of, that you got to clean up to go to God, that you got to get good to go to God. So I've always had to pause here and then at another place where we're going to see it at the 7th step, where I've had to really consider, do I believe He will? Not only Kenny. Kenny's been proven by people around me my whole sobriety. You people. I know that He can. But will He for me? It's a piece of my 2nd step.
And you see the word if, could and would if He were sought. There's that word again. My responsibility is to seek Him. So let's go back to step 1. If I haven't looked at my experience and seen my truth in step 1, then I'm going to sit in meetings and tell you I'm struggling with a 4th step or a 5th step, or I'm working on 6, or I'm working on 7. Do you understand? The foundation of the entire thing. If. You see, I'm the kind of person, unless I see my truth in step 1, why would I go seek power? Why would I go seek God? One of my problems is, I think I'm God. So if I don't see that truth and get reduced down to a state of hopelessness, then I won't go seek power. So it says God could and would if, Mark. If. I told you to pay attention to if and know what it means. If, Mark, seek Him. Are you willing to seek Him, Mark? It's your deal, Mark. You don't have to seek Him, Mark, if you don't want to. I know a lot of people in Alcoholics Anonymous that are not seeking God. They're just going to meetings and not drinking. You see? Gets back to that truth I experienced in step 1. So, being convinced of what? Mark, are you convinced of the ABCs based on your experience? Are you convinced based on your truth? See? Now we're at step 3, which is that we decided to turn our will and our life over to God as we understand Him. Just what do we mean by that? And just what do we do?
There's one of those questions. Remember back on page 45, but where and how are we to find this power? And we've answered it 10 pages later by searching fearlessly deep down within. Well, here's a question. Just what do we mean by deciding to turn our will and our lives over to God as we understood Him? And just what do we do to make this decision? That's going to be answered in a couple pages, and they're going to tell you exactly what they mean and exactly what to do. So let's, just for the sake of having these 5 points marked in our books, let's mark the 5 points I told you we were going to stop at for the 3rd step. Point number 1 is A, B, C, and the next line, question, are you convinced? So that's point number 1. A, B, C, am I convinced of those 3 pertinent ideas? Point number 2, let's mark the bottom paragraph on that page that starts off the first requirement. And that'll be our 2nd point we're going to stop at, is the requirement to take the 3rd step, which we'll come to in a minute. Let's turn the page and go to page 62. Point number 3, bottom paragraph, they're going to answer their own question. This is the how and the why of it. And let's mark, we decided that from hereafter in this drama of life, God is going to be our director, our principal, and our agent. We are His Father, and we are His children. Let's mark that as the 3rd step decision. Point number 3. Point number 4, let's mark the next paragraph on page 63 as the 3rd step promises. That first paragraph at the top of 63. And then let's mark the next paragraph, point number 5, as the 3rd step prayer. So we're going to look at a prayer, we're going to look at promises, we're going to look at a decision, we're going to look at a requirement, and we're going to look at 3 things one needs to be convinced of before they can take the 3rd step. Anything else you wanted to say about the ABCs?
No.
I guess all you can do is say to yourself that the work in the ABCs has been done. If you're not convinced of the ABCs, you have to decide which part you're not convinced of and go back to whichever pages those would cover and go over them again. Obviously, if you're not convinced you're alcoholic, it's somewhere between the doctor's opinion and page 52 with the body, mind, and spirit. having to do with not being alcoholic or not being able to manage your life. If you're not convinced that no human power can relieve your alcoholism, you're probably somewhere back in the chapter to the agnostic. And if you're not convinced that God not only can but will for you, you're probably still on step 2, and you should go back through the chapter to the agnostic again. Now, let's mark just what do we mean by this and just what do we do as to why we need to do why we need to turn our wills and our lives over to the care of God and how we're going to do that, to be answered on page 62. But before we answer that, let's look at the first requirement. The first requirement is that I be convinced that my life, looking at any life won't help you. We've got to look at my life run on self-will can hardly be a success. Question mark.
This is the point in the book where it's critical to use your name or the I word.
Now, they don't expect you to arrive at this point and be convinced totally. So they will now give you about a page and a half, and Mark's going to take us through it using the singular that you can put your own name in, of pages and questions and statements that can be turned into questions to help you become convinced that your life run on self-will cannot be successful. So to meet this first requirement, let's look at what the book gives me to help me, and then we'll come back and see if we need any discussion or if anybody's not convinced. See, why would anybody in this room decide to turn their life run on their will over if you still thought your life run on your will could be successful? See, meeting this requirement only makes sense because I got to tell you, I would never decide to turn my will over to God or my life over to God if I still thought my life run on my will could be successful. So I need to be convinced that making this decision is a good idea. And here's where the book helps me meet the first requirement of step 3.
So as I go through and read this, again, put your name in or use the I word. It says on that basis, meaning Mark running his life on his self-will, Mark is almost always in collision with something or somebody, comma, even though Mark's motives are good. Alcoholics who are nice really scare me. It says Mark tries to live by self-propulsion. Mark is like an actor who wants to run the whole show. Now that's supposed to say director. I'm an actor, but I think I'm the director. So Mark is like an actor who wants to run the whole show. Mark is forever trying to arrange the lights, the ballet, the scenery, and the rest of the players in Mark's own way. If Mark's arrangements would only stay put, if only people would do as Mark wished, the show would be great. You know, every time I read this, it just hits me right down in my gut. Now, here's a little delusion. Everybody, including Mark, would be pleased. Life would be wonderful. In trying to make these arrangements, Mark may sometimes be quite virtuous. Mark may be kind, considerate, patient, generous. Mark may be even modest and self-sacrificing. On the other hand, Mark may be mean, egotistical, selfish, and dishonest, but as with most humans, Mark is more likely to have varied traits. Well, what usually happens? Well, the show didn't come off very well. Mark begins to think. Mark begins to think life doesn't treat him right. So here's what I do. I start thinking. Mark decides to exert himself more, my self-will. So here's what I do. I analyze the situation. Mark will become, on the next occasion, still more demanding or gracious, as the case may be. I will go into my self-will, I'll analyze it and say, do I need to be a hard ass or do I need to be real kind? Should I send flowers or take a stance? What should I do? Still running my life on my will. Still, the play does not suit Mark. Admitting Mark may be somewhat at fault, teeny little bit. Mark is sure other people are more to blame. Here's what happens then. Mark becomes angry, Mark becomes indignant, and Mark becomes self-pitying. What's Mark's basic trouble? Boy, now they're going to even use question marks here. Is Mark not really a self-seeker? Now pay attention to this one. Is Mark not really a self-seeker even when trying to be kind? You know what my truth is today? The only time I do something for somebody without a selfish motive is by mistake. Sit and think about that for a little bit. Now it says, is Mark not a victim of the delusion that Mark can wrest satisfaction and happiness out of this world if Mark only manages well. Get my ducks in a row, right? However, is it not evident to all the rest of the players that these are the things Mark wants, and do not Mark's actions make each of them wish to retaliate, snatching all they can get out of the show? Is Mark not, even in Mark's best moments, a producer of confusion rather than harmony? You see, now it's been describing to me what happens when I live my life on my self-will, to help me be convinced of this requirement. Are you convinced of this? And I don't know about you, but every time I read this, I can't help but flash into my life. And I see that this is me. And so it's trying to show me experientially, Mark, when you live your life on your will, this is what happens. At your very best, you create confusion. Mark, you live in this delusion. You'll be happy and satisfied if you manage well. The right woman, the right job, all this crap, right? I live in a delusion that if I manage well, I'll be happy and satisfied. So now I go back and look at my truth. Every one of us in this room, several times in our life, the ducks have been in a row, and Joe talked about it. How come I'm still empty inside? What's wrong? What's wrong is I'm trying to play God. I'm trying to run my life and my will. I think I know what's good for me. So it goes on to say, Mark is self-centered, egocentric as people like to call it nowadays. Mark's like the retired businessman who lolls in the Florida sunshine in the winter, complaining of the sad state of the nation, the minister who sighs over the sins of the 20th century, politicians and reformers who sure all would be utopia if the rest of the world would only behave, the outlaw safecracker who thinks society's wronged him, and Mark, who has lost all and is locked up. See, I've never been in jail, but I've been locked up my whole life till I had a relationship with God. Whatever Mark's protestations, is Mark not concerned with Mark's resentments, or Mark's self-pity? I hate this because it is so true. Selfishness and self-centeredness, that we think is the root of Mark's troubles. Driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, and self-pity, Mark steps on the toes of his fellows, and they retaliate. Sometimes they hurt Mark, seemingly without provocation. But Mark can invariably find that at some time in the past, Mark has made decisions based on self, which later place Mark in a position to be hurt. So Mark's troubles, we think, are basically of Mark's own making. That's also a great statement of hope. And you're really going to see that in the fourth column of your resentment inventory. And thank God my troubles are my own making. If they're of yours, I may be in trouble, because you may never change. And if I got to wait for you to change to get free and be at peace, I'm in trouble. Thank God my troubles are my own making and nobody else's. Sad news is we're in a culture that's perpetuating the first three columns of the resentment inventory. We become a highly paid victim culture. It's their fault. It's their fault. That kills people like me and you.
So mark that statement. Our troubles are of our own making, and make a note there that you're going to come back to that when you get to the fourth column before you start to write the fourth column of the resentment inventory. We're going to find a way of looking at that so it frees us up rather than sitting there and beating ourselves up.
Goes on to say they, meaning troubles, my troubles. Mark's troubles arise out of Mark. And Mark is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though Mark usually doesn't think so. Self-delusion. Now listen to this next sentence. Above everything, Mark must be rid of this selfishness. What does above everything mean to you all? It means above everything, doesn't it? Now it says Mark must, or it will kill Mark. Now, I had to see the connection between this selfishness and dying an alcoholic death. So let me show you the connection. If I don't get rid of the selfishness and self-centeredness, which is the root of my problem, and I continue to run my life on self-will, the world is going to retaliate on me, and when they retaliate on me, I'm going to get resentful. And when I am resentful, I'm going to get blocked from God, and the spiritual malady will manifest in me, and I will get so uncomfortable that the mental obsession will come back, and I will pick up a drink, and I will activate the craving, and I may never make it back to this program again. Now, you will notice in the next sentence, our name is not in there. God makes that possible. So here's what the book just said. Above everything, I got to get rid of selfishness or I die, and I can do nothing about that. I'm chained to Mark, and there's nothing I can do about it. It says, and there will often seem no way of entirely getting rid of self without God's aid, His aid. It says Mark has moral and philosophical convictions galore. Look at all the moral and philosophical convictions galore everyone in this room has right now. I want to be a better AA member. I want to be a better husband. I want to be a better friend. I want to be a better father. I want to be a better wife. I want to be a better employee. But my selfishness prevents me from manifesting any of that in my life, and I can do nothing about that on my own power. It says Mark could not live up to them, even though Mark would have liked to. Neither can Mark reduce his self-centeredness by wishing or trying on Mark's own power. Mark had to have God's help. See, and now I know why I need His help. I had to have His help, because my experiences show me my truth. I had to have God's help.
Now the next part I told you we would stop at. We've covered 2 so far. That's the ABCs, and combined with am I convinced of them? And number 2, we've covered the 3rd step requirement. So here's the questions. Am I convinced that I'm alcoholic and cannot manage my own life? Am I convinced that no human power can relieve my alcoholism? And am I willing to believe that God can and will if I seek Him? And am I convinced that my life run on my self-will, even when my motives are good, even when trying to be kind, and even in my best moments, when running my life on self-will, it's not successful? Now they're going to answer the question from the previous page, just what do we mean by this, deciding to turn our will and our lives over, and just what do we do to make this decision? Well, they'll tell you, this is the how and the why of it. First of all, why? Why do each and every one of us, having seen what we've seen in the first 2 steps and the first part of step 3, why do we need to decide to turn our wills and our lives over to the care of God? Why? Because playing God doesn't work. That's why. Running my life on self-will is playing God. I'll give you an example. In my first inventory, I'm writing a resentment about a father who was 57 years old when I was born, and he was 67 by the time I was 10. And it was like having a grandfather. And that used to cause me great pain. It now gives me great hope. But how does a 10-year-old kid see how he's playing God? In the 4th column, I started to see how selfish, self-seeking, dishonest, and based on fear my beliefs were, because you know how I was playing God? I knew better than God how old He should have been. I knew better than God how He should have been. I knew better than God how He should have been doing it. I knew better than God in every area of His life and in every area of my life of how it should be. That's playing God. He shouldn't have been 67. He should have been like this. He should have been like this. He should have been like this. He should have been there for this. He should have done this. He should have done that. And this is how he should have done it. That's playing God. And it didn't work. It led only to a 30-year resentment that I couldn't get free of until I saw my part. Playing God didn't work. Next question. How are we going to turn our wills and our lives over to the care of God? I'm sorry. How are we going to decide to turn our wills and our lives over to the care of God? We're going to decide. Here's the 3rd step decision. The 3rd step decision is not the prayer. This is the 3rd step decision. We're going to decide that from hereafter in this drama of life, God is going to be our director. He is the principal. We are His agents. He is the Father. We are His children. Most good ideas are simple, and this concept is the keystone. There's the 2nd stone they've shared with us since the foundation on page 17. It was the first stone, the cornerstone, was on page 47, and this one is the keystone on page 62 at the top of the arch. We're all the way up to the top of the arch now, is the keystone. This is the keystone of the new and triumphant arch through which we're going to pass to freedom. Question. Are you seeking relief, or are you seeking freedom? We're going to talk more about that tonight or tomorrow morning as far as seeking relief and as far that so many of us have settled for and seeking real freedom. So, Mark's going to take us through a guided meditation from the ABCs through the third step decision. He'll then pause for a few moments of silence. I will then read to you the promises that come true based on the third step decision. They come before the prayer. The prayer is not the decision. The prayer is an affirmation that you've already made the decision. And the promises, part number 4 that I said we would pause at, these promises at the top of the next page come true based on your third step decision. I'll tell you how I know that's true. I sat in my sponsor's living room almost 12 and a half years ago and made that third step decision. Before we even did the prayer, he left me alone in that room for a few minutes in silence, and I experienced almost every one of the third step promises before I ever did the prayer. There's a story about a difference between a decision and a commitment, because this step is basically just a decision. The commitment comes in 4 through 9. So I was at one of these meetings in North Denver before I got to the third step. I hadn't done this work yet. I was in my first 5 months before I hit that bottom. And I'm in a meeting in North Denver, and a guy says there's a difference between the decision at the third step and the commitment that follows. And I learned to ask the second greatest question you could ever learn to ask in Alcoholics Anonymous. I said, what do you mean? And I'll tell you, those of you that are new, when you hear some of these old-timers throw out some of these cliches, like you're supposed to understand what they're talking about, ask them what they mean, and you'll find out something real interesting in AA. I'm not going to tell you what you're going to find out, but you're going to find out something real interesting. Remember those times when you're new and you're sitting there and you share some terrible problem, and some guy in the back of the room goes, just turn it over. And you want to take him and you want to strangle him really slow, and you want to say, if I knew how to do that, I wouldn't be here. Right? But they never tell you how to turn it over. They make it sound like you're supposed to just know, and it's the big mystery in AA nowadays. How do you turn it over? We're going to show you precisely how to turn your will and your life over to the care of God after you make the decision. So I'm sitting in one of these meetings, and they're talking about, I'm doing the AA shuffle. Some of you have maybe done it, and I've done it. And I was doing the AA shuffle, and the AA shuffle goes like this. I turned it over, and I took it back. And I turned it over, and I took it back. And this old guy who cared more about me than my feelings about what he might have to say, he actually cared more about me than how I might feel. It's a hard place to get to in AA, to care about other alcoholics more than how they might feel about what you might have to say. You got to start caring more about truth, and you got to start respecting yourself a lot to be taken to a place where you can do what this man did for me. Because he said, if you're still doing that, you haven't turned it over. There's a difference between a decision and a commitment. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, it's like a chicken and a pig walking down the road, and they come to a sign on this big church that says, help feed the poor. And the chicken's all pumped up with virtue because he likes to do nice things for people. And he says to the pig, we ought to do something about that hunger problem. The pig thinks for a minute and he says, well, what could we do about that hunger problem? The chicken says, well, we could feed those poor people ham and eggs. The guy says there's a difference between a decision and a commitment. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if you told someone to just go sit in the corner and pray for ham and eggs, they'd probably just sit there. But if you told someone, and all they did was decide. If you told someone to go sit in the corner and pray for ham and eggs, and they decided to do that, and they did that, and then you showed them how to get up and put one foot in front of the other, and they made one hell of a commitment, they'd probably eat ham and eggs. Because the pig says to the chicken, for you that's just a simple decision to lay some eggs, but for me it's one hell of a commitment. That's a difference between a decision and a commitment. I needed to be convinced several months later of 3 pertinent ideas. A, B, C. I then needed to be convinced that my life... let me say this. I then needed a reason, as if 1 and 2 weren't enough, and that I'm going to drink again without this power. I then needed a reason to decide to turn my will and my life over, and that was that I be convinced my life run on my will is not going to be successful anyway, so I might as well give up that which isn't working anyway. So what have we really gotten free of in the first 3 steps that wasn't already true? What have we gotten rid of in the first 3 steps that already wasn't illusion in the first place? Have we gotten free of anything in the first step that was true? We had no power over alcohol. We've only gotten free of illusion that wasn't even true to begin with. Have we really gotten free of anything that had to do with distance between us and God? He hadn't gone anywhere. There was only illusion to step 2. Now we're going to find that it's total arrogant illusion to even think you can turn your will and your life over to that which gave you your will and your life in the first place. It's only illusions that we've gotten free of in the first 3 steps. So then, being convinced that my life run on my will cannot be successful, I then needed to know how and why to make this decision. First they told me why. Playing God, running my life on my will doesn't work. I needed to quit doing it. And I decided to quit running my life. I think even that's an illusion. The idea that I'm running my life on my will. Right? Every breath comes from the Creator. Then I needed a way to make this decision. And He's going to take us through that. And I'd like you each in your own way, when He takes us through that, to consider 6 terms. 3 about you, 3 about God. The 3 about you that I'd like you to consider are being an actor who no longer wants to run the whole show, an agent, and a child. The 3 that I'd like you to consider about God are director, principal, and father. And as He's taking us through that, consider those terms individually, but then it's good to consider those terms in connection with each other. By that I mean this. He'll take us through and He'll read, God being our director. What would that really look like? What would that really mean? He would actually show me, you move over here, you say this, you do. He could really direct my life like a director. Principal, that He could really be my boss, that I could really serve Him. And Father, that He could meet the needs of a father I've always wanted. Director, principal, father. What do those terms mean to me? And then what about my role from hereafter in this life? Actor who follows the director. Agent. What would it really mean to be God's actor? What would it really mean to be God's agent? What would it really mean to be God's child? My sponsor often says that if one of these ideas from the 3rd step could go from your head to your heart, you would never, ever, ever again have a problem with low self-esteem, ever again, because there would be nothing you could ever do, accomplish, earn, be given, get, be granted, or have in your life that could ever surpass the realization from your head to your heart that you're a child of God. What more could I ever do? So much for the self-esteem problem. If I really got that, I am a child of God. You could never do anything else to work on your self-esteem ever again that could surpass that. So then, as he takes us through this, it's going to be good to consider those 6 terms in connection to each other. Director, actor. How would they interact? Principal, agent. How would they interact? I get to be an agent of God. That turned my whole conception of God 180 degrees, because I thought God was to serve me. And I found out, and they're going to tell us on the next page, He will provide what I need if I keep close to Him and perform His work. I get to serve God, and I get to be His child, and He gets to be my Father. So we want to consider those 6 terms separately and connected. And then from a quiet place, we'll make that decision, each in our own way. Then I'll take us through the promises that come about, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, sometimes from moving on into 4 through 9, sometimes the day you take this and make this decision, and then we will do the prayer. So we've stopped at 5 points. The ABCs, the first requirement, the 3rd step decision, which we're about to make, then the 3rd step promises, then the prayer. Don't ever let anybody tell you there's only 12 promises. And when we deify those and read things like the 12 promises of Alcoholics Anonymous, we really sell this program short to people, because he's going to read, or I'm going to read, after he takes us through this, I'm going to read some really powerful promises, let alone the ones that we've read already before the third step, that come as a result of making this third step decision. Great promises. There's a lot of promises in this book.
So, if everybody would get their, put your feet flat on the floor, and sit with your, again, try and sit with your spine straight and your hands in your lap, and maybe again focus between your eyebrows on the spiritual eye. Let the eye be single. And I'll do a guided meditation here, and then at the end of the guided meditation, we will sit with that third step decision for a little bit, and then Joe will read the third step promises. Heavenly Father, we again thank you for bringing us together as a spiritual body out of your love and fellowship for each other and a desire to seek you. Be with us as we review some things. Heavenly Father, you've given us a description of the alcoholic, and I ask myself, is this me? And we've looked at the chapter to the agnostic, my solution to this horrible illness of body, mind, spirit, Father. And I've looked at my personal adventures before, drinking, and after, to make clear three pertinent ideas to me, Father, based on my experience. A, that I am an alcoholic and cannot manage my own life. Today, Father, right now, this moment. B, Father, that no human power could relieve my alcoholism. And C, Father, that you can and will, if we become willing to seek. And being convinced of those three things, Father, based on my experience, which has revealed my truth to me, we were now at step 3. And in step 3, we're going to make a decision, Father, to turn our will and our life over to you. So we have to look at what we mean by that and how we do that. And the first requirement, Father, before we can do that is we have to be convinced, Father, that our life run and our will just doesn't work. So we go back into our life, Father, and we begin to see that we're an actor but want to play the director all the time, and we want to run the show. And even when our motives are kind, Father, we still have selfish motives, always trying to get our way and live our life by self-propulsion. And we see that all that does, Father, is put us in conflict. And pretty soon people begin to retaliate, and the show doesn't come off very well. We start to think life doesn't treat us right, so we begin to exert ourselves more. And we wind up just being angry, indignant, and full of self-pity. The basic trouble in all that, Father, is we're a self-seeker even when we're trying to be kind, back to trying to live our life on our will. And we see, based on experience, that we suffer from the delusion that we will be happy and satisfied, Father, if we manage well. And we see the truth that there's been times when we thought we were managing well, Father, and we were still empty inside. And we see that our actions make people want to retaliate. And so, Father, once again, I see my truth, and that is that at my very best, living my life on my will, I create confusion instead of harmony. And I see, Father, that I'm very selfish and I'm self-centered, and I seem to be only concerned with myself, my resentments, and my self-pity, as long as I'm trying to live my life on my will. And then, Father, I look at the idea that selfishness and self-centeredness is the root of my problem, and that I'm driven by 100 forms of fear and self-delusion and self-seeking and self-pity, and that I make decisions based on self, Father, which place me in a position to be hurt. And I see, Father, that my troubles are my own making, and I see that my troubles arise out of myself, and I'm an extreme example of self-will run riot. And that above everything, that I must be rid of this selfishness. If I don't get rid of this selfishness, the root of my problem, Father, I'm going to die. And the dilemma that I had with that, based on my experience, Father, there's absolutely nothing I can do about that. Only you can make that possible. And Father, I've had moral and philosophical convictions galore. I never wanted to drink again. I never wanted to hurt people I loved. I wanted to be a better friend or a better husband. I wanted to be a better employee, and I never had any power to pull that off, Father, no matter how much I wished or how much I tried, and I see the truth of that, Father. And now I see that I have to have your help. Now I'm told how and why I'm going to get your help, Father, and that is that the first thing is that I'm going to quit playing God, and I'm going to quit playing God, Father, because it doesn't work.
And now I'm going to make a decision that from here on out in this drama called life, Father, that you're going to be the director in my life and that I'm going to be the actor. And I'm going to look at the relationship that we can have, both individually, my part in that being the actor, and then your part being the director, and knowing that you can direct me as I go through this life. And I'm going to look at the idea, Father, that you're going to be the principal in my life and that I'm going to be your agent. And I'm going to look at that relationship again, Father, and understand that as your agent, you will empower me, Father. And then I'm going to make a decision, Father, that from here on out, you're going to be my Father, and I'm going to be your child. In being your child, I will always be under your trust and care. And you will guide me, and you will protect me, and you will give me wisdom, and you will give me strength, Father. And this decision, Father, becomes the keystone from now until the day that I die, to walk through the spiritual arch and to walk into freedom. And now, Father, I'm going to go inside myself, and I'm going to sit with what it would be like for the rest of my life.
When we sincerely take such a position, all sorts of remarkable things follow. We have a new employer. Being all-powerful, He will provide what you need if you keep close to Him and perform His work well. Established on such a footing, you are less and less interested in yourself, your little plans and designs. More and more you become interested in seeing what you can contribute to life. As you felt new power flow in, as you enjoyed peace of mind, as you discovered you could face life successfully, as you became conscious of His presence, you began to lose your fear of today, tomorrow, or the hereafter. We were reborn. Those promises begin to come true as a result of the third step decision. Sometimes before you even do the prayer. It's happened for me before. I've also always thought it's a little funny that after the prayer, if you notice in the next paragraph, after the prayer, they put, we thought well before taking this step, making sure that we were ready, that we could at last abandon ourselves utterly to Him. And they put it in there after the prayer. Kind of like they wanted us to think well before taking this step, but not too well before taking this step, right?
Now, some of you, too, have experience with these promises. How many of you have come up to the third step prayer, did the prayer, and then didn't write inventory right away? Raise your hands. Everybody raise your hand. See, the reason is the promises came true. We totally ignore the warnings in the big book and the instructions. But that's because the promises come true. I see it happen all the time. The 1, 2, 3, 12, or 1, 2, 3, I've been in inventory 19 months or something.
So then you do this wonderful prayer, and then you move on. Let's stop here.
My name's Mark. I'm an alcoholic. What I wanted to read was this. Remember, we deal with alcohol, cunning, baffling, powerful. Well, that alcohol is too much for us. There's one who has all power. That one is God. Consider this. If He's got all power, how much do you have outside of what He gives you? But also consider something else. If you're sitting here thinking you have any, maybe you won't get any more than what you already have. So maybe an experience with that I have none opens you up to getting more. But it says half measures...
He stole that from me too.
Yeah. Half measures availed us nothing. We stood at the turning point. Now here's another prayer. We ask His protection and care with complete abandon. Bring everything in your life under God's protection and care, including going to church, everything in your life, including your sinning. Bring it under His protection and care with complete abandon. Look up the word abandon. It means let go completely.
You'll find what you put before Him, you lose. He mentioned the word abandon. They just said after the third step prayer, we thought well before taking this step, making sure that we were ready, that we could at last abandon ourselves utterly to Him. I heard a man who's been doing this work for a long, long time asked one time at 26 years what it meant to him doing this work again to completely abandon himself utterly to God. And he said in 26 years doing this work, he never saw anything that would be more of an abandonment to God, an utter abandonment to God, anything more for an alcoholic than to submit themselves to finishing 4 through 9. And that was still the utter abandonment to him, to God. Yeah. Mark mentioned at the break, you notice there's no amen at the end of the third step prayer. So I did this prayer with my sponsor 12 and a half years ago, and I got up off my knees and I said, Don, let me get this straight. That was just a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God. And we made the decision before we even did the prayer, and we made the decision based on the requirement. And we made the requirement based on the ABCs. And he said, right. I said, then if this whole thing was just a decision, how do I turn my will and my life over to the care of God? You know the mystery we were talking about in AA nowadays? Turn it over? Well, how do you do that? And I got up off my knees and I said, well, if this was just a decision, how do I turn it over? And he said, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Acts against the will, contrary to the way you've lived your life. So there's the third step paradox. We turn our wills and our lives over to the care of God by taking direct action against the will, contrary to the way we've lived our lives. We have now seen at least one paradox for each step. The first step paradox. If you look at maybe you're not, you might find out you really are. The second step paradox. If you look at where you don't believe, you might find out you really do. The third step paradox. If you decide to turn your will and your life over to the care of God, to do that, you take direct action against the will contrary to the way you've lived your life. And the second part of the paradox is you get a new life and a will that you can begin to use properly back. See, you think in taking the third step you're giving something up. First of all, you're giving up something that already doesn't work, which is your life run on your will. So you're not really giving anything up. Number two, you're not really giving anything back to that which already created your will and your life. So the illusion that you're giving anything to God is just an illusion. And the third illusion, that you're going to lose something, you're not. You're going to get a brand new life back and a will that the 10th step is going to tell you can begin to learn how to use properly. So you don't lose anything. And the third step paradox is we turn it over by taking direct action against the will, contrary to... And I'm here to tell you, we're going to find in these directions, the precise directions of how to turn your will and your life over in steps 4 through 9. We're going to find those directions, and that action goes directly against your will, and it's directly against the way you've lived your life.
We read this all the time in a lot of meetings. It's in the 12 by 12. It's the prayer of St. Francis. You know what happens to me in the steps? I'm going through the death of self. To be reborn. We read that. We were reborn. Going through the death of self to be reborn, to get back that which has already been there, but I'm blocked from it.
So my other question was, if that was just a decision, and the way you turn it over is 4 through 9, why wasn't there a prayer at the end of why wasn't there an amen at the end of the prayer? He said, well, if you'll notice, there's no amen at the end of the third step prayer, but there is an amen at the end of the 7th step prayer. And he said he believed from his experience that everything from that prayer to that prayer, you're safe and protected. That in there, between 3 and 7, you're in a prayer. It is one prayer. It is one prayer that's ended at the end of the 7th step, and in that space you're safe and protected to examine that stuff within yourself that's blocking you from God. I found that to be true too. I have always been kept safe and protected when I'm moving between having taken the 3rd step and finishing the 7th step, in that space between 3 and 7. To go into that place I really don't want to go into, and I especially didn't want to go into that place alone. I went into that place alone for a long time in therapy, and all kinds of therapy, and I didn't want to go one more time into that place without God for the reasons I used to go into that place. So let's look at what they tell us about going into this next step. We're going to launch out on a course of vigorous action. This is the first step of action, which is a personal house cleaning, which many of us have never attempted. Though our decision at step 3 was a vital and crucial step, it could have little permanent effect unless at once followed by a strenuous effort to face and to be rid of the things in ourselves which have been blocking us.
Highlight that.
Our liquor was but a symptom. So now we have to get down to the causes and conditions. Let's talk about that paragraph for a minute. we're on the top of page 64. My sponsor told me there's two ways to go into inventory. One is to tell a little kid, go down in your room and clean everything up. And he thinks it's a terrible job because all he can do is go down there and move stuff around and rearrange stuff. But if you told the same little kid, go down in your room and throw everything out that you don't want anymore for all new stuff, he would go down in that same room and the same job would be joyous because he was going in there for the right reason. That's the attitude to take into inventory. We are going into that place, that dirty room, to clean out the stuff that blocks us from God, to be rid of it. To be rid of. Not work on, not cope with, not deal with. We're going in there, inventory, and they're going to tell us from now on what each step is about. This step is about a strenuous effort to face and be rid of the things in ourselves which have been blocking us. Blocking us from what? Blocking us from ourselves, blocking us from others, blocking us from God.
You know, it saddens me a lot in meetings. Most people in this room have been around long enough to be to meetings, and when the discussions in the fourth step come up, this picture is painted like this is some big horrendous monster. Now, based on the work we've done so far and the experience they had, how can the people in this room not get excited about writing inventory? We're going to face and remember, first of all, the book says where you're going to find God deep down, Mark, but you got to search fearlessly. Now it's telling us, Mark, we're going to face and be rid of the things that have you blocked from the power. How in God's name can a room full of people, based on what we've looked at in this book, not get excited about facing and being rid of that stuff? You see, if I don't go through this book and have an experience in the first three steps, I hear this stuff and I buy into it. Oh, it's going to be this terrible thing. No, it's not. It's an exciting thing. Face and be rid of the things that have me blocked from the source of power. You see? It's an exciting thing. That's the way I present the fourth step to the people I work with. Let's get excited about this thing. We're going to write inventory in the power of God. I'm not going to write it out of your head, and we'll show you how to do that. But you understand what I'm saying? I would hope when you leave here, maybe when you start talking about inventory experientially, meaning you've gone in and written the inventory with His power, done 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Maybe now when we start sharing in meetings, we can share from a different standpoint. Because that sharing, the lies about what inventory is, prevents a lot of people from not writing inventory. See? Face and be rid of the things that have me blocked from God. How does one not get excited about that? Okay? You see? And again, a warning I think is important. Liquor's but a symptom. Look up the word symptom. We told you this before. The book said this. Doctors don't treat symptoms, folks. They treat the problem. The problem's not alcohol. That's why the book says the elimination of alcohol is but a beginning. Alcohol is a symptom. You see? It's a symptom. We're going to get down to causes and conditions. So therefore we start upon a personal inventory. This is step 4. A business which takes no regular inventory usually goes broke. That line's a little contradictory to only do an inventory one time. Taking a commercial inventory is fact-finding and fact-facing process. Now it says it. Remember, inventory. It's an effort to discover the truth. Highlight those 3 words. God is truth. In inventory, we're going to discover the truth about the stock in trade. Whatever that truth is. If you're full of shit, it's the truth. So what? One object is to disclose damaged or unsaleable goods. To get rid of them promptly and without any regret. If the owner is to be successful, he cannot fool himself about values. So we did exactly the same thing with our lives. We took stock honestly. First thing we're going to do, we're going to search out the flaws in our makeup. Remember, troubles of our own making? I'm going to search out the flaws in my makeup which caused my failure. See, this part of the book pulls you totally out of any being a victim in any part of your life. See, here's the truth for every one of us. We are exactly where we are, living who we're living with, living where we're living, working in the job that we're working in because of actions we have taken or not taken, and it's nobody's responsibility but ours. Troubles of our own making.
We mentioned this during the break, but it should be said that this is the time where you drop the set-aside prayer. You start to use the third step prayer each day. Try to use it in the morning. Try to use it at night. and try to use it each time you sit down to write inventory. Also try this. Find a prayer that works for you about inventory. I usually take a prayer from the top of that page, something like this. Dear God, please help me face and be rid of the things in myself which are blocking me from you, myself, and others. Please show me the truth. And then when you start to write, you can start to write from that place we talked about that's deep down within, that you'll start to notice your prayer life starting to come from. I only knew 2 kinds of prayer before I got to the third step, and the 2 kinds of prayer that I knew about were the kind of prayer that comes out of your mouth when you say the words, God, I offer myself to Thee. And then there's another kind of prayer when you're silent and you hear the words up in your head. As I started to practice going within before I would pray, and I'd go to that quiet place and then I would start to pray, I started noticing words coming from deep down within. Interior prayer. And they weren't in my head, and they weren't just coming out of my mouth, although sometimes I would say them out of my mouth, and then I would get silent and I would hear them coming from down here. That's the place we want to tap into for inventory to come from. You don't want to write inventory from your head. You want to write inventory from your gut. Right? Sometimes stuff will come out of your gut, out on through the pencil, onto the paper that haven't even registered in your head yet. Right?
So it goes on to say, being convinced that self, manifested in various ways, was what had defeated us. We're going to consider it self's common manifestations. So we're got back to, again, the root of our problem is self. And they're going to talk to us about how self manifests. So it says resentment is the number 1 offender. Resentment destroys more alcoholics than anything else.
That's a very interesting statement. Resentment destroys more alcoholics than alcohol? It says, resentment destroys me more than anything else. And from resentment stem all form of spiritual disease.
For I have been not only mentally and physically ill, what we've looked at, craving of the body, obsession of the mind, I have been spiritually sick, the unmanageability of my life, that internal condition.
There's the 3 parts to step 1 that we looked at. We've been not only bodily and mentally ill, we've been spiritually sick. And when the spiritual malady, my God, the big book actually uses the term spiritual malady, and it actually says that alcoholism is a 3-fold disease, body, mind, and spirit. We have not only been bodily and mentally ill, we have been spiritually sick. And when the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. That doesn't mean I can drink. That means I straighten out mentally, therefore I would never get an obsession, therefore I would never take the first drink. Now we'll start to go through the instructions. We're going to look at 3 separate inventories. We're going to look at a resentment inventory, we're going to look at a fear inventory, and we're going to look at a sex inventory. Let's start with resentment. And let's look at a 4-column resentment inventory.
Let me say one thing first. Remember, we've talked about the path of consideration. The last sentence. When the spiritual malady is overcome, I straighten out mentally and physically. So the path of consideration says, well, what's the other side of that? The other side is, if the spiritual malady is not overcome, I will not straighten out mentally and physically. The spiritual malady is treated in steps 4 through 9. 4 through 9. And the reason I know that is when you get to the 10th step, the problem's been removed. What problem? The mental obsession. Sanity's been restored. You can trust your will. It's aligned with God. So it's both a promise and a warning. The promise is when the spiritual malady is overcome, I straighten out mentally and physically. The warning is if it's not, I won't. See? That's an interesting thing to look at relative to be given the power to do 4 through 9, isn't it?
Not cover this 3rd column.
No.
Just the words.
Yeah.
Okay. Instruction number 1. Column number 1. In dealing with resentments, you're going to set them on paper. You're going to list people, institutions, or principles with whom you were angry. Stop. Don't go any further. The big book now becomes, rather than a book where you turn every statement into a question, which you should continue to do, but now you don't go past any direction until it's been completed. We are going to write inventory down, and we're going to read it across. We are going to do 1 column at a time, and we're not going to move to the next column until the preceding column is done. This is column 1. and we are going to go home and we're going to make a list of people, institutions, and principles with whom we were ever angry. Notice there the key word is were. We listed people, institutions, or principles with whom we were angry. I believe you begin to trust God. You trust God. The power to have inventory revealed is there, and if the name comes, put it down. Some people need to get out 20. Some people need to get out 50. Some people need to get out 300. Some people need to get out 700. Some people don't judge the length of your list or the number on it. It doesn't matter. You trust God and you go with what needs to be emptied out of your consciousness. You can only write about what's revealed. But I also believe if the name comes to you, thank God from the bottom of your heart that He revealed that to you, because it's one more thing that you get to get rid of, that you get to get free of. And now Mark's question that he always asks becomes very paramount in steps 4 through 9. And the question is, with inventory 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, the question is, how free do you want to be? How free do you want to be? Now, making this list, people are simple. People are people. Institutions are a little tricky. They can be institutions, the bill collectors, public service, drug programs, institutions where you've been. The institution of marriage. It can also be groups of people. Fat people, ugly people, black people,
AA.
Mexicans, Polacks, AA. Right? It can be groups of people. Ignorant people, arrogant people,
Big
rich
book
people.
thumpers.
Big book thumpers, right? And principles are values and beliefs that you were raised with, and also values and beliefs that you're told in AA you need to live by to stay sober. And I'll tell you what, every time I find a principle that I've resented, I've also resented its opposite at another time in my life. For example, I've resented truth. I've resented lies. I've resented selfishness. I've resented unselfishness.
I've resented love. I've resented hate. I've resented honesty. I've resented dishonesty.
My family was on there. My brothers were on there. My sister was on there. Every girlfriend I ever had was on there. The first one is the first one. And I'll also say this. When you start the work, or if you're doing the work for your first time, enjoy it. Really enjoy it. Because you're never going to do the work for the first time ever again. And you're also never going to do the work without power ever again. And you also need to know this. You're not doing the work without power this time either. Sometimes the first time through the work, it literally feels like you've just been given enough to barely do that step which you're on. And sometimes that's the truth. But you've been given the power to do the step you're on. And some people always ask, Joe, what's the most important step? And I know there is a step that's the most important of them all. There is a step that is the most important step of them all. And that's the one you're on.
And in one of the 11-step instructions around...
And by that I don't mean 4. I mean what step you're on. Whatever step you're on. That's the most important.
Because you get to the 11th step and it's interesting. It addresses that from a standpoint of making a statement. It's on page 87. We usually conclude the period of meditation with a prayer. God, please show me all through the day what my next step is to be. Different ways you can look at that. But Joe's right. The most important step I'm on is the one I'm on right now. And I'm in the process of the amends. So if you said to me, what step are you on? I'm 9. Those who have been around the program know the instructions in the book are that I begin to practice 10 and 11 at the same time the day I commence to make amends.
So actually where he would be he's using 10 and 11 and 12 to do the 9th step. So I kept asking Don, how will I know when the list is done? And he kept saying, you'll know when the list is done the moment you know the list is done. And that's all I can tell you. You'll know the list is done when you're sitting there one day and nothing more comes out. Now we're going to talk about a real valuable tool for inventory. Each time you sit down to write, and every time you sit down to write, and if you take a break from writing and you come back to writing, when you sit, say a prayer. Maybe you say the 3rd step prayer, maybe you say your inventory prayer, and review 1, 2, and 3, your own first 3 steps. Some people, for the first several times, they'll read from the ABCs up to where they are in inventory, just to bring them to where they are. Some people get good at it, and you can just review your own first 3 steps, and it literally takes you to a state of consciousness where writing happens rather than having to make it happen. And then you run dry, and you begin to operate. You can literally feel the inventory moving back and forth between your spirit and your head. You move back up into your head, you stop. You pause again until you move back down into your spirit. And then some more will come from your spirit, and you'll slowly move back up into your head. You pause, you stop. You do not want... Imagine the difference between this. If somebody said, sit down and write the capitals to the 50 states, you would sit down and you would be working with your mind, and you'd be going through this mind that you have to remember capitals of states. That is not where you want to work on inventory. You want to continue to center yourself inward to that place where the inventory will come to you rather than from you. So you work on the list until you know it's done. You don't have to do them in columns. You don't have to worry about saving space. Just fill a notebook up with names, however many come out of your consciousness. Like I said, different people have different amounts to get out of their consciousness. I can tell you, Mark will tell you how many were in his last one. My last, I don't know how many will be on this one. I'm in 4 right now. My last one, I had 40 resentments. 12 years sober. After a year of doing 10 and 11 on a regular basis. There were 40 resentments that snuck by, that didn't come to my consciousness until I did 1, 2, and 3 again, that I would have sworn. I said to my best friend when I started that inventory, I'm not going to have that many resentments. And there were 40. And each inventory has gotten smaller, and each one is as deadly, because it's this year's stuff. It's the stuff that's going to currently kill me. Sticking guns in people's faces and robbing and running and ripping was the stuff that was killing me when I got here. I don't do that stuff anymore, but I do even slicker stuff. I do stuff the ego has now convinced me I can get away with now that it's refined itself. And I'll say things, well, I'm not living like I was when I got here, but I can lie, cheat, and steal in different ways in different areas of my life today, and that's not going to kill me. Yeah, it is. It's that stuff which is currently blocking you from God that will one day block you to the point where the obsession will return and you'll drink again. It's this year's stuff. That old stuff ain't going to kill me. I've done the work on that stuff and I've made my amends. It's this year's stuff. It's this stuff. It's today's stuff. How many did you have in the first column last time?
I had about the same number. I wrote... begin to write inventory. In that one day, we went through the first 3 steps together as a group over about 9 hours. I started inventory that day, and I had... what I'm really talking about when I say I had about 40, that was my second column. I probably had about 20 people, institutions, and principles, but I see my resentment in the second column, and so in some of those... I wrote. I had more than one resentment against, say, a person. So I had about 40 in my second column, too.
Let's not confuse that yet. He had 20 in the first column, his list. Now, let's look at the next line. So when would I go on to this next line? I'd go on to this next line when I know my list is done. And the next line, it's the only line for column 2, is we asked ourselves why we were angry. Stop. Mark that line, column 2. Okay, so you got this, let's say you got this pad with all these names on it. People, institutions, and principles, and you know it's done. If a name comes and you say, well, I don't feel that way about that person anymore, it still came. It needs to be on your list. It's people, institutions, and principles with whom we were angry. So now the list is done, you go to column 2. How do I go to column 2? I take the first name off the list, and I put it over on a new piece of paper, and I number it. 1. We're going to number the first column, and then we're going to letter the second column. A, she did this. B, she did that. C, she did this. D, she didn't do this. Let it flow. You're taking their inventory. You're asking yourself why you were angry. She left me. She stole $500. Right? All this stuff. I'm taking their inventory. The second column is their inventory. Like my friend said, you put the son of a bitch in the first column and you put what the son of a bitch did in the second column.
And be truthful with that.
There's some things you can only say in a certain way, right?
Here's what I mean about being truthful. I've had people come to me. Here's the other thing I do when I have people write inventory. I give them the instructions for the first column. When they're done with that, I have them come back to me.
Look at it.
And I look at it with them. And then we take a sheet of paper. We take the first name off the list. And then I have them write some second column. I'll give you an example of what I see sometimes, because it's amazing how my ego doesn't want me to see truth, or it really loves to exaggerate. This is a common one around mom and dad, right? Let's say that dad's in the first column. So column 2, I just had this happen recently. Here's what the guy wrote. He wrote, "My dad abandoned me." And he wrote 2 of them. "My dad abandoned me," and "My dad was never around." And so here was my question. I said, well, let me make sure I understand this. You were born, and your dad left, and you never saw him again. He said, well, no. I said, well, what? I don't understand. He said, well, my dad worked a lot. He owned a business. And I said, then why don't you write the truth in the second column? But I said, it's sure neat to go to AA and tell everyone your dad abandoned you and was never around, wasn't it? Instead of telling them the truth. Second column. See, if you don't write the truth in the second column, what do you think 3 and 4 are going to show you? It all hinges in the second column, so we want the truth. Stay away from words like never, she was always a bitch. No, that's not true. Okay? Never there for me. No, that's not true. What's the truth? You see, we're looking for truth.
He was dishonest, too general.
Yeah.
He lied to me about the money.
Right.
I was walking down the street on January 2nd, and he walked up to me and punched me in the mouth. Don't need all that. I resent Charlie because he punched me in the mouth. You don't need to be too wordy. You don't need to be too vague. It's about being direct.
No.
She acts stupid? No. What does she do? What does she do that makes you feel like she acts stupid? She does this, she does this, she does this.
You see that, like, she doesn't appreciate me. What the hell does that mean? What does that mean? Get more specific. Okay? She never gets me a birthday card. All right, I can work with that. She doesn't appreciate me? What does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. You see, but it's interesting about the second column, because I've looked at a lot of them, and the truth is that my ego has exaggerated so much, and you know why it has? Because it allows me to feed the resentment and stay drunk and die. That's why.
Here's the interesting thing. Bill gives us 2 ways to write the second column, and I didn't notice this for a long time. Follow me on this. Notice with Mr. Brown...
He's on page 65.
The example. Notice with Mr. Brown, and put a number, like we're going to number Mr. Brown number 1 off our first column list from another tablet. And then letter A, B, C. You can see that he does 3 separate resentments. Pays attention to my wife, affects my sex relations, my self-esteem, and there's fear involved. And B, told my wife about my mistress, and there's a 3rd column next to it. And C, may get my job at the office, affects my security and my self-esteem, and there's fear involved. Now, with Mrs. Jones, who I would put a number 2 by, he lumps about 4 resentments into 1 paragraph. She's a nut. She snubbed me. She committed her husband for drinking. He's my friend. She's a gossip. And he does 1/3 column. Then you'll notice he does the same thing for the employer. Lumps a bunch together. Unreasonable, unjust, overbearing, threatens to fire me for drinking and padding my expense account. Then my wife, he does the same thing. Misunderstands, nags, likes Browns, wants house put in her name. That's about 4 resentments. I choose, and we would like to encourage you to, do it the way he does it in the first example with Mr. Brown. 1 second column at a time, separated by a 3rd column for each one. What am I saying? I'm saying for every first column there's a second column, and for every second column there's a 3rd column, and do the second column separately rather than lumping a bunch into 1 paragraph. It's much more effective. So, I'm taking a name off the list. I'm putting it. This is not complicated. I made my list. My list is done. People, institutions, and principles. A whole other pad that's going to be thrown away anyway, so you don't worry about space or none of that. Take the first name off the pad, put it on a piece of paper, number it. Charlie did this. A, stole $500. B, punched me out. C, stole my girlfriend. However many comes for Charlie. There might be 10 for some people, big people. Mom, dad, sister, brother, girlfriends, wives, husbands. There might be 1. Let it flow till nothing comes. You're letting the second column flow out of your consciousness just as you let the first column flow out of your consciousness. How will you know when the second column is done? When you know the second column is done on that person. Then go to the second person off your list. It's always a suggestion. Don't start with the big ones first. Get in the groove with a few. You're also going to experience states of consciousness and lines of power as you move from the first to the second to the third and to the fourth columns. Lines of power. By what do I mean by that? When you're in the first column, you're in a state of consciousness where you're looking at those sons of bitches that made you angry. People, institutions, and principles. You are in a state of consciousness. You will then notice a line of power drawn as you move into the second column, and you will begin to experience another state of consciousness where you go deeper into the anger and you experience why they made you angry. You will then, between column 3 and 4, experience another shift in consciousness where it's brought right back to you and there's freedom. So the second column is what they did or didn't do that made you mad. Let's say number 3. I wouldn't suggest doing my dad as number 3, but let's say number 33. I've gone through some, I'm in the groove, I'm getting the feel for the second column, and I come to my dad. And this is my first one, 12 and a half years ago, when I was 7 months sober. Don't let anybody ever say it's too early to go into the 4-step. It's too early to go into the 4-step if you haven't done 1, 2, and 3. That can kill you. If you've done 1, 2, and 3, it's too soon not to go in. Our decision was vital, but it must be followed at once by this strenuous effort. At once. So I put my dad's name and I put number 33 by him, and I started a list. Was 57 when I was born. Didn't show up for football. Didn't show up for baseball. By the time I was 10, he was 67. It was like having a grandfather. And I lettered them. A, B, C, D, E. I don't know how many I had the first time with my father, but I started to see something. Something started to happen.
And then you'll continue writing the second column till you're done. If you have 50 names, people, institutions, and principles in column 1, you will continue with the second column till you're done with the second column. You write down, not across. How many of you tried to write inventory across before? Okay, the big book ends with sentences with a period. Okay, in the English language, that means complete this before moving on. They don't have commas in there.
One instruction at a time. Now, I've got this jumbled mess where I've got the person's name. We're using a lot of paper, but we're going to end up having a lot of space. The ego would love it if I could put about 20 on one page and cram as many second columns as I could, and then cram as many down here as I could and try to scribble in the fourth column. We're going to end up with one resentment per page. But now I've got these pages where I've got the person's name, and then I've got A, B, C, D, however many came out. Now we're going to be asked to do the third column. Now, I'm going to take the person's name off the page again. I'm going to put it in another tablet, the final tablet, and I'm going to put that person's name at the top of the page, and I'm going to take one resentment, A. If for somebody like Charlie, I had A, B, C, D, E, if I had 5 resentments in the second column, I'm going to end up with 5 pages. You're going to get a workbook tonight or tomorrow that's going to show you great examples of 4-column inventory where we do 1 resentment per page. So I'm taking the first and second column off this notepad that I have over here, and I'm taking just the person's name, Charlie, and I'm taking the first resentment off there, A, and I'm going to put punched me out in front of my friends. Then I'm going to put 7 areas of self which might have been hurt, threatened, or interfered with when Charlie punched me out, and I'm going to go down the page. The big book says in most cases you'll find, and let's mark these 7. Number 1, self-esteem. Number 2, pocketbook. Next line, after the line we were just on. Column 1, we listed people, institutions, or principles with whom we were angry. Column 2, we asked ourselves why we were angry. Column 3, in most cases you'll find that your self-esteem, pocketbook, ambition, personal relations were hurt or threatened Mark those two words, hurt or threatened. So we found 3 so far. 4. Self-esteem, pocketbook, ambition, and personal relations. So we were sore, we were burned up. Now there's a confusing paragraph because he repeats himself, and we'll find a couple new ones also. On our grudge list, we said opposite each name our injuries. Self-esteem we already got. Here's a new one. Security. Ambition we already got. Personal relations we already got. Here's another new one. Sex relations. Which had been interfered with. Mark the word interfered. Now where do we find the 7th one? Look all the way down at the bottom under my wife, and you'll find in the 3rd column he uses the word pride. That's number 7. So let me read you the 7 once again. Self-esteem, pocketbook, ambition, personal relations, security, sex relations, pride. So here's what I say to myself. When I resented Charlie for punching me out in front of my friends, did it, I don't have to write this, but I use this as a guide, hurt, threaten, or interfere with my... When Charlie punched me out in front of my friends, did it hurt, threaten, or interfere with my self-esteem? You better believe it did. I put down self-esteem. Did it interfere with my pocketbook? Yeah. I had to go to the doctor and get my jaw realigned. It cost about $1,000, right? Pocketbook. Did it hurt, threaten, or interfere with my ambition, which is what I want? Yeah, I want Charlie to leave me alone. Did it hurt, threaten, or interfere with my personal relations? Yep. Not only with Charlie, but with the friends that were watching. How about my security? Yep. How about sex relations? Yep. That girl didn't want me no more after she saw Charlie punch me out. How about pride? That's how others see or feel about me. Yep. And you know what I found? When Charlie punched me out in front of my friends, it affected all 7 areas of my life. So I now have a piece of inventory that looks like this. Charlie's name in the 1st column, and I numbered it 1. Charlie, what he did in the 2nd column, punched me out in front of my friends, and I lettered it A. And then I went down the page and found all 7 areas of self were hurt, threatened, or interfered with. And I'm going to do that for every resentment I have for Charlie. So if I have 5 resentments for Charlie, I'm going to have 5 pieces of paper that look like this with a different 2nd column in each one. Let's say my next resentment would be number 1, Charlie, B, stole $500. Affected my self-esteem, my pocketbook, my ambition, my personal relations, my security, my sex relations, and my pride. It would look just like this, except it would have a new 2nd column.
Let me take an example off this current inventory I did, which I find extremely humorous today. Column 1 was a young man I sponsored. His name was Jeff. And Joe knows Jeff. I mean, this guy's been to 2 of our workshops, for God's sakes, right? And here's what column 2 looked like. He drank. He stole money from my home group. Mine, my home, mine. He took advantage of a friend of mine. Started telling lies to his parents. There were a few more. That's my 2nd column. So behind each one of those resentments of Jeff, then if on the 1st one, he drank. 3rd column, self-esteem, how I think or feel about me. Did that affect me? Of course, I was a sponsor, for God's sakes. Right? So self-esteem's affected. Pride, how others see me. Ha! Was that affected? just a little, right? Personal relations with the same sex, were that affected? Yeah. I've never seen him since. You know, he was important in my life, so he's unavailable to me. So that was affected. Pocketbook, was that affected? Well, a little bit, yeah, a little bit. I gave him a bunch of money and did some stuff, and so that was affected. Sex relations, no, that wasn't affected. Security, what I need, yeah, I needed him to be sober. He was important in my life. Ambition, what I wanted him to be sober. You see? So that's just one resentment, and those are the areas of my life that in the 3rd column that affected. And you see so much more. Like if I had 6 resentments toward Jeff, I see so much more if I write the 7 areas that are affected behind each one of those 6 resentments than if I lumped all 6 together and wrote them one time. You see what I'm saying?
So why am I using a whole piece of paper for one piece of inventory? Why am I using one piece of paper for every second column? Well, not so much for this line going down here where I examine what was hurt, threatened, or interfered with, but for this space down here where we're now going to move into the 4th column. People tell you the 4th column's not in the book. Well, they're wrong. They get confused because Bill gives us an example with 3 columns, but you're going to find here in a page or so that they tell us to write out the 4th column. So the bottom of 65, after Bill's example, and keep in mind we're going to write the way he did with Mr. Brown, but we're going to put his attention to my wife on page 1, told my wife about my mistress on page 2, and Brown might get my job at the office on page